"I'm sorry, sir, but we need to move you to economy class." Sergeant Major William Hayes looked up from his boarding pass, his weathered face showing confusion rather than anger. The airline representative, a young woman with nervous eyes, fidgeted with her tablet as she delivered the news that would change everything in the next 8 minutes. "There's been an overbooking situation," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have some very important passengers who need these first-class seats." William's hand instinctively moved to his chest, where the distinctive purple ribbon of the Victoria Cross lay beneath his dress uniform. He had been traveling in his military dress blues, as was protocol when representing the Crown at official functions. The medal, Britain's highest military honor, seemed to weigh heavier now. "I understand there are important passengers," William said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military service. "But I'm traveling on official business for His Majesty." The representative glanced around nervously. Behind her, William could see other airline staff watching the interaction with growing interest. A few passengers in the boarding area had begun to notice the commotion. "Sir, I really am sorry, but the decision has been made. These passengers are, well, they're paying customers who booked the premium package. Your ticket was provided by the government, and according our policy." William felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had served his country for 32 years. He had been wounded in Afghanistan, decorated for valor in Iraq, and had spent the last 5 years as part of the King's personal guard detail. The Victoria Cross on his chest represented the day he had saved 17 soldiers under enemy fire, nearly losing his own life in the process. But none of that seemed to matter to the airline. "What's the premium package?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Well, it's when passengers pay extra for guaranteed first-class seating, premium service and—" She trailed off, realizing how it sounded. William looked past her to see who these important passengers might be. A group of well-dressed individuals stood near the gate, laughing loudly and taking selfies with champagne glasses. Their designer luggage was being handled with extra care by the ground crew. One of them, a man in an expensive suit, caught William's eye and smirked. "Those are your VIP passengers?" William asked quietly. The representative followed his gaze and nodded reluctantly. "They've paid for our Platinum Experience package. It's our highest level of service." William stood slowly, his full height making the young woman step back. At 6 feet 2 inches, with shoulders broadened by years of military training, he was an imposing figure, even in his 60s. The ribbons and medals on his chest caught the fluorescent light of the terminal. "And what level of service does someone who served his country get?" William asked, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made nearby passengers turn their heads. The representative swallowed hard. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but company policy is very clear. Premium-paying customers take priority over government-issued tickets." William felt the eyes of other passengers on him now. Some were pulling out their phones, sensing drama unfolding. He could hear whispered conversations starting around him. "Is that a Victoria Cross? I think he's military. They're downgrading a soldier?" The young woman seemed to realize that the situation was escalating beyond her control. She pressed her earpiece and spoke in hushed tones to someone on the other end. William remained standing, his bearing erect, despite the humiliation. He thought about the letter in his jacket pocket, a personal message from the King, thanking him for his service and requesting his presence at tomorrow's ceremony. He thought about the 23 men who hadn't come home from his last deployment, men who would never have the chance to be humiliated by an airline representative. "Sir," the woman said, returning to him with an even more nervous expression, "my supervisor says we can offer you a voucher for future travel and complimentary drinks in economy." The champagne drinking group nearby had grown louder, apparently enjoying the spectacle. One of them was now openly filming with his phone. William looked at his watch. In exactly 7 minutes and 30 seconds, his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. But for now, he simply nodded and picked up his single carry-on bag. The walk from the first-class boarding area to economy felt like the longest 100 yards of William's life. Every step echoed in the terminal as passengers turned to watch the decorated soldier being escorted to the back of the plane. "This is unbelievable," whispered an elderly woman to her husband as William passed. "That man is wearing the Victoria Cross." The husband squinted at William's chest. "Good God, you're right. There are only a handful of living recipients." William heard their conversation but kept his eyes forward. The airline representative walked beside him, tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. Her supervisor, a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit, had joined them for the walk, occasionally glancing at his watch as if he had more important places to be. "We really do appreciate your service, Sergeant Major," the supervisor said, his voice dripping with the kind of false sincerity that made William's jaw clench. "And we want to make this right. We were upgrading you to our premium economy seats." William stopped walking. The sudden halt made both airline employees bump into each other behind him. "Premium economy," William repeated, turning to face the supervisor. "Yes, sir. It's really quite comfortable. More legroom, better meals, priority boarding for your return flight. You moved me out of first class, where I was booked on official government business so that some tourists could take selfies with champagne," William said, his voice carrying clearly across the boarding area. "And I think premium economy makes that right." The supervisor's face reddened. Around them more passengers had stopped what they were doing to listen. Several were now openly recording with their phones. "Sir, please keep your voice down," the supervisor whispered urgently. "We don't want to cause a scene." "I'm not causing a scene," William replied, his military bearing evident in every word. "I'm asking a simple question. Why does someone's ability to pay for a platinum experience matter than someone who served their country?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. The supervisor looked around nervously, clearly aware that they had become the center of attention. "Company policy clearly states," he began. "I know what your policy states," William interrupted. "What I want to know is why you think it's acceptable." Near the first-class boarding area, the group of premium passengers had grown larger and louder. One of them, the same man who had smirked earlier, was now pointing at William and making jokes to his friends. Their laughter carried across the terminal. William's military training had taught him to assess situations quickly. He could see that airport security was beginning to take notice of the gathering crowd. He could see phone cameras recording from multiple angles. He could see the airline staff growing more nervous by the second. What he couldn't see was the black sedan that had just pulled up to the terminal's VIP entrance. "Look," the supervisor said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We're going to board you first in premium economy. We'll make sure you have everything you need for a comfortable flight." "Will you?" William asked. "Because what I need is to be treated with the same respect you're showing to people who paid extra to get drunk at 35,000 feet. The words hit their mark. The supervisor's face went from red to pale in seconds. "Sir, I need to ask you to board the aircraft now," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We have a schedule to maintain." William looked at his watch again. 5 minutes and 20 seconds. "Of course you do," he said quietly. As they resumed walking toward the economy section, William noticed a commotion near the terminal's main entrance. Several people in dark suits were moving with purpose through the crowd. Airport security was suddenly very alert, speaking rapidly into their radios. But William's attention was drawn back to the immediate situation when one of the premium passengers called out loudly enough for half the terminal to hear. "Hey, soldier boy, don't worry, we'll take good care of your fancy seat." The laughter that followed was like fingernails on a chalkboard. William stopped walking again, this time turning to look directly at the man who had spoken. The premium passenger, emboldened by his friend's laughter and apparently unaware of the growing crowd of onlookers, continued his commentary. "Maybe next time you can afford to fly with the rest of us important people." The terminal seemed to grow quiet around them. Even the airline supervisor looked horrified at his passenger's behavior. William took a step toward the group, his training taking over. The way he moved, fluid, controlled, dangerous, made the laughter die immediately. "Is there something you'd like to say to me?" William asked, his voice carrying the authority of command. The premium passenger's bravado evaporated as he got a closer look at the man he'd been mocking. The Victoria Cross was clearly visible now, along with the other ribbons and medals that represented a lifetime of firsts. For a moment, the only sound in the terminal was the announcement of departing flights. Then everything changed. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came from airport security. Their casual alertness suddenly transformed into sharp, professional focus. They began moving passengers away from certain areas while speaking rapidly into their radios. William noticed the change immediately. His military experience had taught him to read the subtle signs of an evolving security situation. But his attention was still focused on the premium passenger who had just finished insulting him.
"I asked you a question," William said, taking another step forward.
The man who had been so bold moments earlier now looked like he wanted to disappear. His friends had stopped laughing and were suddenly very interested in their phones. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," the man stammered, apparently realizing that mocking a decorated war veteran in public might not have been his best decision. "Didn't mean anything?" William repeated. "You think service to your country doesn't mean anything?" The airline supervisor was now frantically trying to get between them, but William's attention was divided. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see more security personnel taking positions throughout the terminal. This wasn't normal procedure for a commercial flight. "Gentlemen, please," the supervisor pleaded, "we need to board the aircraft. We have a schedule." He was interrupted by a voice over the terminal's public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special arrival at Gate 12. Please maintain clear walkways and remain calm." Gate 12 was 50 yards away from where they stood. William looked in that direction and saw something that made his blood run cold with recognition. The distinctive formation of Royal Protection officers. "Oh no," he whispered. The airline supervisor followed his gaze. "What's happening over there?" William's mind raced. He knew that formation. He had been part of it countless times over the past 5 years. The way the men moved, the way they positioned themselves, the careful attention to sight lines and exit routes. This was advanced security for a member of the royal family. "Sir, we really need to board now," the representative said urgently, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. William watched as the security perimeter expanded. Airport police were now directing passengers away from Gate 12, creating a clear corridor. The terminal's background noise seemed to fade as people began to notice that something unusual was happening. "Is that the police?" one of the premium passengers asked nervously. William didn't answer. He was counting security personnel and noting their positions. 12 visible officers, which meant at least 6 more out of sight. This level of protection meant senior royalty. His phone buzzed with a text message. William glanced at it and felt the world tilt slightly. "Flight delayed. HM arriving Terminal 2. Stand by. HM. His Majesty." William looked at his watch. 3 minutes and 10 seconds. "What's wrong?" the airline supervisor asked, noticing William's expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Sir, please, we need to board," the representative insisted, but her voice was drowned out by another announcement. "Terminal 2 security alert. All passengers please remain in designated areas and follow instructions from security personnel." The premium passengers were no longer laughing. They huddled together, looking around nervously as more uniformed officers appeared throughout the terminal. "This doesn't look normal," one of them said. William's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from a number he recognized immediately, the King's private secretary. "I have to take this," he told the airline staff, stepping away from the group. "Hayes," he answered. "William, where are you?" The voice on the other end was crisp and urgent. "Terminal 2, Heathrow. I'm supposed to be boarding flight." "No, you're not." His Majesty diverted here unexpectedly. "We need you at Gate 12 immediately." William felt his heart rate increase. "Sir, I'm having a situation with the airline. They've downgraded me to economy and—" "William," the voice cut him off. "His Majesty is here. Now. He specifically asked for you to be present when he arrives." The phone went dead. William stared at the device for a moment, then looked back at the airline staff who were watching him with growing confusion. "Is everything all right?" the supervisor asked. William looked toward Gate 12, where he could now see the distinctive black vehicles of the royal motorcade visible through the terminal windows. Security personnel were taking their final positions. "I need to go," he said simply. "Sir, you can't leave. Your flight is boarding," the representative protested. William looked at her, then at the supervisor, then at the group of premium passengers who were still clustered nearby, no longer quite so confident in their VIP status. "Watch," he said quietly. At that moment, every security officer in the terminal stood at attention. The public address system crackled to life once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Majesty King Charles III. The terminal fell completely silent, and William Hayes, holder of the Victoria Cross, began walking toward Gate 12 with the measured pace of a man who had been personally summoned by his king. Behind him, the airline staff stood frozen, finally beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. The walk toward Gate 12 felt different from the humiliating march to economy class. This time William moved with purpose, his military bearing on full display as he navigated through the crowd of suddenly quiet passengers. Airport security personnel recognized him before he reached the perimeter. A tall officer with sergeant's stripes nodded as William approached. "Sergeant Major Hayes." "Yes. We've been expecting you, sir." "This way, please." The security cordon parted, and William found himself inside the protected area, just as the royal party emerged from Gate 12. His Majesty King Charles III walked with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, flanked by his protection officers. The king's eyes found William immediately. "Sergeant Major Hayes," the king said, his voice carrying clearly across the secure area. "I was told you might be traveling today." William snapped to attention and bowed his head respectfully. "Your Majesty, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Nor are you," the king replied, moving closer. "I'm making an unexpected stop before tomorrow's ceremony. But I'm glad to see you here." The king's gaze moved to William's chest, where the Victoria Cross was clearly visible among his other decorations. "You're in dress uniform. Were you traveling on official business?" "Yes, Your Majesty, for tomorrow's memorial service." The king nodded thoughtfully. "And how was your travel experience, Sergeant Major?" It was a simple question, but William knew that his answer would have consequences far beyond this moment. Behind the security perimeter he could see the airline staff watching with growing alarm. The premium passengers who had been so confident earlier were now pressed against the windows, trying to understand what was happening. "It was educational, Your Majesty." The king raised an eyebrow. "Educational?" William chose his words carefully. "I learned something today about how some people view service to the crown." "Oh?" The king's expression became more focused. "Tell me." Around them, the protection officers maintained their vigilant watch, but William could sense their attention was divided between security concerns and the conversation unfolding before them. "I was booked in first class for official travel," William began. "But the airline informed me that I needed to be moved to economy to make room for passengers who had paid for what they called a platinum experience package." The king's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I see. And what was their reasoning?" "They said that premium-paying customers take priority over government-issued tickets, even for someone traveling on crown business." "Apparently so, Your Majesty." The king looked past William toward the airline staff, who were now huddled together in obvious distress. "And where are these premium passengers now?" William gestured toward the group that was still pressed against the terminal windows. "There, Your Majesty." They found the situation quite amusing. The king studied the group for a long moment. Did they indeed? One of the king's private secretaries approached and whispered something in his ear. The king nodded, but didn't take his eyes off the airline staff. "Sergeant Major," the king said, "would you be so kind as to ask those airline representatives to join us?" William felt a surge of satisfaction. "Of course, Your Majesty." He walked back toward the security perimeter, where the supervisor and representative stood frozen like deer in headlights. "His Majesty would like a word with you," William said simply. The supervisor's face went completely white. His Majesty." "King Charles III, William clarified, as if there might be some confusion. "He's right over there." The walk back to where the king waited was the longest 50 feet of the supervisor's life. The representative had to be physically supported by her colleague, her legs having apparently forgotten how to function properly. "Your Majesty," the supervisor stammered, attempting something that might charitably be called a bow. "You are?" the king inquired. "Thomas Mitchell, Regional Operations Supervisor for the airline that decided Sergeant Major Hayes didn't deserve the courtesy due to someone traveling on crown business." It wasn't a question. Mitchell swallowed hard. "Your Majesty, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. Our policy clearly states—" "Your policy," the king interrupted quietly, "states that someone who has served the crown with distinction, someone who wears the Victoria Cross, should be moved to make room for tourists with champagne. The terminal around them had grown so quiet that every word carried clearly. Passengers throughout the area had stopped what they were doing to watch the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. "Sir, that is, the company has procedures for..." "Mr. Mitchell," the king said, his voice carrying the authority of 1,000 years of monarchy. "Are you familiar with the Victoria Cross?" Mitchell looked desperately at William's chest, then back at the king. It's a military decoration. It is the highest military decoration for valor in the face of the enemy in the British honours system. There are fewer than 20 living recipients." The king's voice grew colder. "Sergeant Major Hayes received his for saving 17 soldiers under enemy fire in Afghanistan, nearly losing his own life in the process." The silence in the terminal was deafening. "And you moved him to economy class," the king continued, "to make room for people taking selfies with champagne." Mitchell opened his mouth, but no words came out. The king looked past him toward the premium passengers, who were now clearly visible through the windows, some still holding their phones up to record what they obviously didn't understand. "I think," the king said quietly, "we need to have a broader conversation about how this airline treats those who serve their country." The king's private secretary materialized beside him with the efficiency that comes from years of royal service. "Your Majesty, shall I contact the airline's headquarters?" "Please do," the king replied, never taking his eyes off Mitchell. "I believe they'll want to be informed about their customer service policies." Mitchell's face had progressed from white to green. "Your Majesty, please, we can resolve this immediately. We can put Sergeant Major Hayes back in first class, upgrade him to our best available." "Can you?" the king interrupted. "And what about the other service members who don't have the good fortune to encounter royalty in airport terminals? What happens to them?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's axe. William watched as airport security began to manage the growing crowd of onlookers. Word was spreading throughout the terminal that the king was present, and passengers were pulling out phones to capture what they instinctively knew was an extraordinary moment. "I want to understand something, Mr. Mitchell," the king continued. "These premium passengers who took precedence over a Victoria Cross recipient, are they here?" Mitchell's eyes darted toward the group still clustered near the windows. Several of them had realized that their behavior was now under royal scrutiny, and were trying to blend into the background. "Yes, Your Majesty, but..." "Invite them over." Mitchell looked like he might faint. "Your Majesty?" "I said invite them over. I'd like to meet these Platinum Experience customers, who are more important than someone who served his country." William had to suppress a smile. He recognized the tone in the king's voice. It was the same one he used when addressing Parliament on matters of national importance. Polite, controlled, and absolutely devastating. Mitchell approached the group of premium passengers with the gait of a man walking to his own execution. William could see him gesturing frantically, and he could see the growing horror on their faces as they realized what was happening. The man who had mocked William earlier was shaking his head vigorously, but Mitchell was insistent. Finally, the group began the long walk toward the royal presence. "Your Majesty," the king's protection officer murmured quietly, "we should consider the security implications of..." "I'm quite safe, thank you," the king replied. "I'm surrounded by some of the finest security personnel in the world, and I have a Victoria Cross recipient standing next to me. I think we can manage a conversation with some tourists." The premium passengers approached like condemned men. Their earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that their behavior had been observed by the highest authority in the land. "Gentlemen," the king said as they stopped at what they clearly hoped was a respectful distance. "Ladies, I understand you've had an interesting flight experience today." The man who had been so vocal earlier seemed to have lost his voice entirely. He stared at the king with the expression of someone who had just realized that the person he'd been mocking was the sovereign of the United Kingdom. "I was told," the king continued conversationally, "that your Platinum Experience was more important than ensuring proper courtesy to a decorated war veteran." "Your Majesty," one of the women in the group stammered, "we didn't know." "Didn't know what?" the king asked. "That service members deserve respect, that the Victoria Cross represents the highest form of military valor, or simply that treating people with basic human dignity is expected." The group stood in mortified silence. William found himself oddly sympathetic to them. He remembered his own first encounter with royalty, The overwhelming sense of being completely out of one's depth, the fear of saying something wrong, the acute awareness that every word and mejig was being evaluated. But he also remembered the man's laughter, the cruel jokes, the casual dismissal of his service and sacrifice. "I'm curious," the king said, addressing the vocal man directly. "What exactly did you find so amusing about Sergeant Major Hayes being moved to accommodate you?" The man opened his mouth several times before any sound emerged. "Your Majesty, it was just..." "Yes, we didn't understand who he was." The king considered this for a moment. "And if you had understood, if you had known he was a Victoria Cross recipient, would that have changed your behavior?" "Yes, Your Majesty, absolutely." "I see." The king's voice grew even quieter. "So your respect for someone depends on their decorations rather than their service?" The man realized he was digging himself deeper. "No, Your Majesty, that's not what I meant." "What did you mean?" The terminal around them had grown so quiet that the only sounds were the distant announcements of departing flights and the soft rustle of the king's protection officers, maintaining their positions. William looked at his watch. In exactly 2 minutes this encounter would end, and the real consequences would begin. But first, the king had one more question. "Tell me," he said, looking at each of the premium passengers in turn, "what do you think appropriate service to one's country looks like?" The premium passengers stood before their king like schoolchildren called to account for their misbehavior. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by something William recognized from his military service, the look of people who had suddenly understood the true gravity of their situation. "I asked you a question," the king said patiently. "What does service to one's country look like?" The woman who had spoken earlier cleared her throat nervously. "Your Majesty, I suppose it means serving in the military?" "That's one form of service," the king agreed. "What others might there be?" Another member of the group, a younger man who had been filming everything on his phone until security confiscated it, ventured an answer. "Emergency services, police, firefighters, paramedics." "Good. Continue." "Teachers," another offered hesitantly. "Healthcare workers, people who work in government." The king nodded at each suggestion. "All correct. Service to one's country takes many forms. It's the teacher who spends their own money on school supplies. It's the nurse who works extra shifts during a crisis. It's the civil servant who processes benefits for people in need." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And sometimes," he continued, looking directly at William, "it's the soldier who runs toward enemy fire to save his comrades, knowing he might not survive." The group followed his gaze to William, many of them really seeing the Victoria Cross for the first time. "Sergeant Major Hayes," the king said, "would you be willing to tell these folks what happened in Afghanistan?" William felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied memories of that day. "Your Majesty, I don't..." "Please, I think it would be educational." William looked at the faces around him, the airline staff, the premium passengers, the growing crowd of onlookers being held back by security. He thought about the 17 soldiers who had gone home to their families because of what he had done that day. He thought about the 3 who hadn't. "We were on patrol outside Kandahar," he began quietly. "Our convoy hit an IED, an improvised explosive device. The lead vehicle was destroyed, and we came under heavy fire from multiple positions." The terminal seemed to grow even quieter, if that was possible. 17 soldiers were trapped in the kill zone. The enemy had positioned themselves to prevent any rescue attempt. Command was ordering us to fall back and wait for air support. "But you didn't fall back," the king said. "No, Your Majesty, I couldn't watch those boys die while waiting for help that might not come in time." William's voice carried clearly across the terminal now. Passengers throughout the area had stopped what they were doing to listen. "I went in alone, made 4 trips under fire to extract the wounded. On the last trip," he paused, the memory still sharp after all these years, "I took shrapnel from a mortar round, spent 8 months in hospital. And all 17 soldiers survived," the king added. "Yes, Your Majesty. All 17 went home to their families." The silence that followed was profound. William could see tears in the eyes of several passengers who had gathered to listen. Even some of the airline staff were visibly moved. "That," the king said, addressing the premium passengers directly, "is what service looks like. And that is the man your airline decided to move to economy class so you could take selfies with champagne. The man who had mocked William earlier stepped forward. His face was red with shame. "Your Majesty, I owe Sergeant Major Hayes an apology. What I said was inexcusable." He turned to William. "Sir, I'm deeply sorry. I was ignorant and disrespectful, and there's no excuse for my behavior." William studied the man's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Apology accepted." The king nodded approvingly. "That's a start. But apologies, while important, don't solve the underlying problem." He turned back to Mitchell, who had been standing frozen throughout the entire exchange. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to call your headquarters. I want to speak with whoever makes policy for your airline." Mitchell fumbled for his phone with shaking hands. "Yes, Your Majesty. Right away." And Mr. Mitchell, "Yes, Your Majesty. While you're making that call, I want you to think about something. Every day, service members, veterans, police officers, firefighters and other public servants use your airline. Every day, you have the opportunity to show them the respect they've earned through their service." The king's voice grew stronger, carrying to every corner of the terminal. What happened here today wasn't just about Sergeant Major Hayes. It was about how we as a society choose to treat those who sacrifice for others. It was about whether we value service or just money. Mitchell nodded frantically as he dialed. "I understand, Your Majesty." "Dewey, because I'm not sure you do." "Not yet." The phone call was answered immediately. Even from several feet away, William could hear the voice on the other end becoming increasingly agitated as Mitchell explained the situation. "They want to speak with you directly, Your Majesty," Mitchell said, holding out the phone with a trembling hand. The king took the phone with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to changing people's lives with a single conversation. "This is King Charles," he said simply. And in that moment, William knew that everything was about to change. The conversation between the king and the airline's CEO lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. William knew because he was watching the terminal clock, fascinated by the complete transformation taking place around him as words spread through Heathrow that the monarch was personally addressing what was quickly becoming known as the Victoria Cross incident. "I understand," the king said into the phone, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. "And I want to be very clear about my expectations going forward." Airport security had expanded their perimeter as more passengers gathered, drawn by the unprecedented scene. William could see news crews beginning to set up outside the terminal. Somehow, word had reached the media. "No," the king continued, "I don't think you do understand. This isn't about one incident or one passenger. This is about how your company chooses to treat the people who serve this nation." Mitchell stood nearby, no longer green but having progressed to a sort of grey pallor. The representative who had originally downgraded William looked like she might faint at any moment. "Sergeant Major Hayes," the king said, covering the phone's microphone, "I believe you have somewhere to be tomorrow." "Yes, Your Majesty. The memorial service for the fallen." "Then we need to ensure you get there properly." The king returned to his phone call. "Yes, I'm still here. Now let me tell you what's going to happen." William found himself thinking about the 23 names that would be read tomorrow, the 23 soldiers who hadn't made it home. He thought about their families, about the ceremonies and honors and the small gestures, respect that helped heal the wounds left by loss. "First," the king said into the phone, "Sergeant Major Hayes will be upgraded to your finest accommodations, not just for this flight, but for any future travel. Second, you will implement a policy ensuring that all service members and veterans receive priority treatment, regardless of how their tickets were purchased." The premium passengers stood nearby, no longer the confident group they had been an hour earlier. Several were openly weeping as the full impact of their behavior sank in. "Third," the king continued, "you will make a public statement acknowledging what happened here today and outlining the steps you're taking to ensure it never happens again." Mitchell's phone was buzzing constantly now. William could see him frantically texting, probably trying to manage what was clearly becoming a public relations disaster of epic proportions. "And fourth," the king said, his voice growing colder, "you will make a substantial donation to military charities in Sergeant Major Hayes's name. I'll leave the amount to your conscience, though I suspect your shareholders will have opinions about the cost of this lesson." The king listened for a moment, then smiled slightly. Excellent. I'm glad we understand each other. He handed the phone back to Mitchell, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Your CEO is a very reasonable man, the king told him. I think you'll find that your company's policies regarding service members are about to change dramatically. Yes, Your Majesty, Mitchell managed. And Mr. Mitchell? I'll be following up on this personally. I have a tendency to remember things that matter to me. The crowd of onlookers had grown to several hundred people, held back by an increasingly large contingent of security personnel. William could see people throughout the terminal holding up phones, broadcasting the scene live to social media. Sergeant Major, the king said, turning back to William. I believe your flight is ready for boarding. First class, naturally. Thank you, Your Majesty. No, the king replied firmly. Thank you. For your service then, and for your dignity today. You've reminded us all what honor looks like. As they shook hands, the king leaned in closer. The memorial tomorrow. I'll be there. It would be my honor to sit with you during the service. William felt his throat tighten with emotion. That would mean everything, Your Majesty. The walk back to the aircraft was different from anything William had experienced in 32 years of military service. The crowd of passengers